So the previous lesson, we spent some time thinking about the economic state of Russia during and before the First World War. I want to spend a little bit of time in this lesson thinking about the social state. And of course, the things we focused on in the previous lesson will, of course, inform some of the things that we're going to talk about here, because the economy, of course, affects society very, very greatly. And so we'll have to think of that in conjunction with thinking about society as well. It should be noted then, when we begin this series of lessons and we begin this study, that when we think about the way in which Russian society was organized at this time period, we can see that Russia is defined by a highly hierarchical order and quite a deep sense of social stratification, as is noted on the screen here. As I mentioned, approximately 80 to 82%, maybe as high as 85%, I think I mentioned in the previous lesson, of the population was peasantry. Despite the fact that there were reforms, major reforms in 1861, which saw the emancipation of the serfs, there are still quite heavy burdens that peasants have to live under. They're quite high taxes, quite low land holdings, quite poor harvests year on year, and also widespread poverty more generally. So really between 80 and 85% of the population is part of the peasant class. I think, I mentioned 85% in the previous lesson. It's around that amount. Okay, of course you can't know the exact number of people who are peasants and who were not. More broadly, and one of the reasons why you can't know this with the kind of accuracy that you might want, is because there's a lot of there's stratification in the sense that there is movement, okay? Because there is a growing industrialization taking place, the peasant class, some of whom move towards the more urban environment to become industrialized workers. So even though there is a growing amount of industrialization, however, this is still quite a small amount. Around 4% of the population at this time period are working class industrialists. Urban workers endured quite squalid housing conditions. There were examples of 16 people on average per flat in St. Petersburg, for example, in 1904, or Petrograd in 1904. There is a growing, an emerging middle class of sort of bankers and industrialists and merchants that is beginning to emerge, but again, they're holding relatively limited political power in a deeply autocratic society, a society that is deeply reliant on the elites. It's deeply reliant on the monarchy and the nobility and the high officials who retained the vast amount of wealth, land, and influence. Another major social event that happens is, of course, the disruptions associated with the First World War. Mass conscription sweeps away around 15 million rural men. This represented about half of the male workforce at the time, leaving in their place the elderly and women to manage farms and to also manage the work of the sort of domestic front, the home front, as it is sometimes described in other conflicts. And this results in a number of factors, things like a falling in grain production, a stalling in mechanization as tools and horses begin to become requisitioned as well. We also start to get policies of grain requisitioning. I'm not going to try and pronounce the the Russian phrase for grain requisitioning, but this was basically the policy of the government taking grain. The government taking and using that grain for themselves. This is a policy that will have drastic and catastrophic consequences in the 1930s when we get to that. But even during this time period, it is having consequences in terms of both social unrest and also starvation. We can see, for example, why and how grain requisitioning policies become so resented. Tambov peasants, for example, began to attack landowners and seized grain stores in 1916. In places like Kursk and Samara, for example, peasants began to refuse to pay their rent and begin to confiscate the landlord's land. We start to see then deep social unrest happening as early as 1916 as the result of government policies of basically requisitioning grain. The Great Retreat, of 1915, of course, results in a refugee crisis, where approximately 3.5 million civilians, mainly from Belarus and Ukraine, become displaced as the result of the war effort taking place in that part of Eastern Europe. The fleeing armies, widespread looting, and policies to evacuate Orthodox communities begin to devastate these rural parts of the country. In the urban environment, in the cities, there are major crises that are taking place. The first is a transport collapsing. So, for example, around 30% of the railway stock became unusable by mid-1916 as the result of the logistical challenges associated with bringing food in, with taking supplies and munitions out, and also moving troops and moving soldiers around the country. Unreachable food prices began to lead to a greater amount of discontent as the result of skyrocketing inflation. Food prices, for example, would increase from around 400 to 500% by late 1917, which is, of course, going to cause major issues. In terms of industrial labour, we can see that around a 60% increase can be seen in Petrograd, and around a 35% increase can be seen in Moscow, showing that there is a surge in the amount of industrial labour. But one of the problems associated with this is the fact that the conditions on the war front and as the conditions more broadly and more generally become worse and worse, we start to see a worsening of industrial labour conditions as well. So you see the increase from around 12-hour shifts to 14-hour shifts. You see that there are factory incidents going up as high as 50 to 100% in places like Putlov, while also at the same time, real wages are lagging behind the soaring costs as the result of inflation. There's an inflation in the prices of goods and stuff of that nature, but there is not an inflation in terms of the wages to account for that and to increase along with that. So basically, the purchasing power of an ordinary industrial labourer is decreasing as their conditions and the amount of time they actually have to work is increasing. It doesn't take a genius to understand how that is going to start to lead to widespread industrial and social unrest. Because of the conscription policies of the Russian state as the result of the First World War as well, it should be noted that around 43% of Petrograd's industrial workers were female by 1917, labouring under quite hazardous conditions. Basically, women bear the brunt of the industrialization policies that resulted in the fact that we are now at war and the fact that there is a major crisis of manpower on the front. Manpower that, of course, is going to be drawn from ordinary workers that were formerly workers. And so the rallying point of revolution becomes the bread riots. There are examples and illustrations of bread riots that took place earlier in the history of the First World War. So in August 1915, for example, women began to loot bakeries when prices were doubled and troops had to be deployed to suppress that revolt. And then in March 1917, we can see that there is mass protests at making the start of the February Revolution quite clear. The final point I want to make is with regard to soldiers and also government policies. So one of the things that is also taking place alongside this is the fact that there are major medical crises and casualties as the result of the First World War. Russia has a tendency in war to basically experience a loss of life and a casualty rate that would be just completely unacceptable to any other nation's army at the time. We'll make this comparison when we look at World War II. When we look at the comparison between the Allies in the West, their kind of casualty rate and the loss rate of their casualties compared to the Soviet Union, and it's just a massive disparity. World War I is not really any different. It's lesser in terms of scale, but it's not really any different in terms of broader attitude. Russia loses approximately 1.8 million soldiers, with around 3.9 million people being wounded as a result of the war. There were just around 17,000 doctors for the millions of casualties, and so many soldiers are, of course, unable to be seen to, and many soldiers are now facing appalling conditions and high amputation rates, which is, of course, a condition of a major crisis in a military. The result is, of course, mutiny and mass desertion, poor leadership. There is a lack of morale. There is brutal discipline that leads to desertion rates. Around 365,000 people deserted in early 1917 alone. You have major naval mutinies. The battleship Ganut, for example, or Gangut, sees a mutiny taking place as well in around the same time. And there is also garrison insurrections in Petrograd that become symbols of this broader collapse. All at the same time, you have broader policies of collapse as well. So you have infrastructure collapse. Railways were commandeered by the army that led to civilians being cut off from the rest of the food and material supplies. You have the prohibition in September 1914 of alcohol. So Tsar Nicholas II banned state vodka sales, a measure that was intended on its face to improve productivity and morale, but what this did was the complete opposite. It led to a dropping of morale, because people couldn't drink while they were at war, and it also eliminated a key revenue stream and drove inflation. So the sort of state sales of vodka was actually quite a profitable part of the economy that would lead to a worsening of the economy. And so, of course, we're starting to see a clash taking place where the bureaucracy and there's a sort of political breakdown. Nicholas's decision to take command of the army himself in 1915 left governance in the hands of quite unpopular individuals. His wife, for example, was a German-born princess, which, of course, then carried on fueling more and more opposition. You also have the fact that as the war is worsening, Nicholas has basically taken the silly decision to take command of the army, which basically means that every single defeat, every single collapse in military structure, every single boom to morale, or shall I say a shot to morale, is now at the hands of Nicholas. He is now associated with every single military failure, and he is left in terms of governing the country, someone who was born in Germany, someone who was a German-born princess, who is now, of course, not very popular herself either. And so that leads to basically an association of the Tsar with military defeat, which is going to cause greater amounts of antipathy and animosity towards the Tsar himself as well, which, of course, is going to contribute to the February Revolution, the subject of the next lesson.